matters regarding Zimbabwe. The African Union's Economic, Social and Cultural Council has partnered with civil society in Zimbabwe in the call for sanctions imposed on that country to be lifted. Now, the group says that penalties have made it difficult for government to access lines of debt relief and has negatively affected the economy, resulting in the current over 80% unemployment rate. And we are joined now by Martha Shumba, who is an activist based in South Africa and a member of the Southern African Civil Society. Thanks so much for coming through, Martha. Let me start off by just perhaps testing the temperature here with regard to the economic situation in Zimbabwe currently. I was reading through some people's social media profiles and talking about bread at a cost of around 30 Rand per loaf in South African Rand terms. What are people saying in Zimbabwe at the moment about the economy?
Things are very tough back home. The prices are very, very high. And that 30 Rand is not easy to get. Here in South Africa, I can ask somebody for 100 Rand right now, you can give it to me. To get $1 in Zimbabwe, you sweat, you bleed. Things are very, very tough, and we don't know who to turn to. We don't know what to do anymore. We have the farms. People produce their own goods, but where to sell them? We don't have the market.
So let's talk about these sanctions and the call for sanctions to be lifted. Let's just go back slightly in terms of the sanctions, why they were imposed, who were they imposed against, and what is still in place today.
There were sanctions that were imposed on individuals, which, for example, the former president of Zimbabwe, Mugabe, and the whole ZANU-PF leaders. And right now, the sanctions that we are talking about, sanctions like the Zidera sanctions, which affects the private sector, your agriculture, the banking sector. And those sanctions does not affect the leadership. It affects the poor Zimbabweans. It's like putting poison in a communal well, expecting to kill the rich people, and they all drink bottled water. And we are the ones who are feeling the poison. Somebody who is doing farming in Gokwe, planting cotton, they can't sell their produce. They can't do anything because of those sanctions. I can tell you that between early 2018 and now, the Zimbabwean president, the current president, Mnangagwa, have been trying. They've been investors, about 100, lined up to actually sponsor Zimbabwe, but they can't because of those sanctions.
So who are the people standing in the way of the sanctions being lifted right now?
Obviously, the USA, the EU, for their own reasons. The first sanctions were imposed because of the land reform in Zimbabwe that was during Mugabe's time. And we cannot say the sanctions were justified. They were not. They didn't serve their purpose. We are suffering because of the sanctions. Yes, some people might argue that the policies in Zimbabwe, the violation of human rights and whatnot. But what causes all of that? What causes all of these fights? Do you think if we had food on the table, we were going to fight for all of that? Were we going to loot and fight and protest? No, we're not going to do that. But right now we have nothing.
So what is the explanation then for the sanctions not being lifted at this stage?
Yeah, their explanation is that the leadership, ZANU-PF and whatnot. But when we look at the sanctions themselves, they are not aimed at the ZANU-PF. They are not aimed at Mnangagwa. They are aimed at private sectors. We cannot access funding. Not at all. And some people say the recent events in Zimbabwe where people were beaten up and killed could have been the reason. But I beg to differ. Police in the USA have killed more black people than in Zimbabwe itself. So that cannot be justified.
But let me just understand you correctly. By the same token, I hope you're not justifying the killing of people.
No,
anyway.
No, I am not justifying that. The violence is not good. Violent, whether by the people of Zimbabwe or the government or the soldiers, no. It's a big no-no. We cannot tolerate violence in the country. Protests are allowed. but do not ban property. Protests are allowed, but do not ban police stations and whatnot. No. For every action, there is a reaction from both sides, the government and the people. And we should all understand that. What Zimbabwe needs right now is not people in the street with placards that let's beat one another. No. It's for everybody to come together to rebuild the country. Removal of sanctions is not about MDC. It's not about ZANU-PF. It's not about me as an individual. It's an African thing. When you look at Libya, the Congo, we all watched the sanctions, being imposed, and we did nothing. South Africa itself and other African countries should come together to say sanctions should be removed. Why? Because if you do not help Zimbabwe right now, who will come here? Not only us, our grandmothers, grandfathers, cats and dogs as well.
Well, some would argue you are already here. But I can hear people screaming at their TV screens in Zimbabwe saying it's easy for you to talk, to say, people shouldn't do this, that or the other. You're sitting in sunny South Africa. You're sitting in Johannesburg. You probably had breakfast to eat this morning. And as you were saying, it's not easy for someone sitting in Zimbabwe to even come by $1.
Yes, we are here to support our families. I cannot go back home right now. I so wish to be at home to do what I am doing right here. But even here in South Africa, it's not easy. Documentation. My first job when I was 18 here in South Africa, I worked as a maid for a family of 22 people, earning 400 rand, 7 days a week.
Family of 22 people?
22.
Where was this? Just by the way, I know it's in the south.
Mokopane, that's in Limpopo.
Oh. 400 rand.
400 rand. So, Monday to Sunday. So it's not easy, even for us who are here. My first 5 years in the country, I was just hustling just to go by. And that whole 400, I have to make sure that my mother come and collect it. Otherwise, they will suffer. So we cannot say the diasporans shouldn't talk. We are also suffering. Everybody. The sanctions in Zimbabwe are not only affecting people who are based in Zimbabwe. They are also affecting South Africans because we are competing for jobs with the South African youth. And these jobs are scarce.
So what do you think needs to be done to rebuild Zimbabwe and especially the Zimbabwean economy at this stage?
First, removal of sanctions. We are not asking for handouts. We are not asking for donations. We are saying allow us to trade. Allow us to sell our beef. Allow us to sell our cotton overseas so that we can be able to sustain ourselves. That's what we are asking. In terms of policies that should be put in place to change the humanitarian situation in Zimbabwe, yes, we'll get to that. And we are already working on that since this is the new Zimbabwe without R.G. Mugabe. Isn't it what we marched for?
New Zimbabwe, you have your deputy president in South Africa for medical treatment, and people are saying those who had the might of the government of the state visited on them are sitting in dilapidated hospitals back home. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that is a very bad situation that the whole country is facing. It's not fair for an ordinary Zimbabwean to see our leaders being treated outside the country and then, an ordinary Zimbabwean dying in Zimbabwe. So the situation has to change. We need to come together. I cannot go to leadership and say change 1, 2, 3, 4. But right now, what I'm fighting for as civil society, as the African Union, as the Zimbabwean Council of Churches, as the Zimbabwe Exile Forum, we are fighting for sanctions to be removed so that we can have a fair share. And when that is done, then we can say, how come we still have leaders that are going to South Africa for treatment?
Oh, thank you so much for stopping by this morning. Martha Shumba, activist and a member of the Southern African Civil Society, for talking to us about the call for sanctions to be lifted against Zimbabwe. And we always want to hear your views at Morning Live SABC.